They said rules were rules, that being late, even by 2 minutes, was enough to erase every year of loyalty I had poured into those walls. 2 minutes. That's all it took for my name to be stripped from the schedule, my badge taken, and my place in that office erased like I had never mattered at all. I remember standing there, my heart racing, staring at the man behind the desk who could barely look me in the eye as he told me it wasn't personal. It was policy. For him, it was just another decision in a day full of paperwork. For me, it was the collapse of decades of devotion, humiliation wrapped in a thin envelope marked termination. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I carried a secret powerful enough to turn that humiliation into the beginning of something far greater. They thought they were pushing me out. In truth, they were setting the stage for me to come back in a way they could never imagine. I stayed silent, biting my tongue, letting their smugness hang in the air like smoke. Because sometimes silence is sharper than words. I walked out of that office without arguing, without pleading, without reminding them of all the years I had given, all the nights I had stayed late, all the mornings I had arrived early. I let them believe they had won. And yet, as I stepped into the cold air outside, I whispered to myself, this is not the end. This is the turning point. What they didn't know was that months before I had received something life-changing. My late father, who had built his life with discipline and sacrifice, had left me an inheritance. I had kept it hidden, guarded in silence, because I never wanted money to define me. I wanted to prove I could stand on my own. But that day, when they stripped me of my dignity for a delay of 2 minutes, I realized silence could also be strategy. And the inheritance I had tucked away was no longer just a number in a bank account. It was my weapon, my shield, my path to justice. Before I take you deeper into this story, I want to pause and ask something of you. If stories like this, stories of betrayal, of hidden strength, of comebacks no one sees coming, speak to your heart, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people, maybe someone who feels powerless right now, to find the courage they need. Because sometimes all it takes is hearing that someone else has risen from the same ashes you're standing in. I am 72 years old. I worked in that company longer than some of the managers had been alive. I poured not just hours, but pieces of my life into making sure others succeeded. And yet, in the end, none of it mattered. They looked at a clock, saw the hands tick 2 minutes past, and decided I was disposable. That is the cruelty of the world we live in. Loyalty weighed against seconds, humanity measured in policies, dignity erased in silence. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. What they call the end is often just the opening scene of a greater story. So let me ask you, have you ever been punished for one mistake while all your years of dedication were ignored? Have you ever felt that sting of being invisible, treated like a shadow, discarded like you never mattered? Hold that feeling close, because what comes next is proof that sometimes the smallest injustices spark the biggest transformations. For most of my life, mornings were not mine. They belonged to the company. I would rise before the sun, sometimes before the birds even began to sing, pulling on the same set of clothes, carrying the same bag, walking the same streets. My neighbors used to joke that they could set their clocks by me, that I was as reliable as the sunrise itself. And in a way, they were right. I had given my life to a routine that never cared for me, to a place where my name was rarely spoken, with warmth, but my absence would have been noticed instantly. The company was like a second home, though not the kind you dream of. It was cold, impersonal, with fluorescent lights that hummed louder than conversations. The hallways smelled of ink and burnt coffee, and every desk was lined with people who looked more like machines than human beings. We weren't encouraged to speak, to connect, to breathe. We were there to perform, to exist in silence until the clock told us otherwise. I remember my first day there. I was nervous, carrying a hope like a fragile glass in my hands. The manager at the time had said, "We value discipline here. Loyalty will take you far." And so I gave them both, discipline and loyalty, like offerings at an altar, believing one day I'd be rewarded. I showed up early, I stayed late, I filled in when others quit. I was dependable to a fault. If someone needed help, I was the one who stayed behind. If someone needed a task no one else wanted, it landed on my desk. And though the thanks were rare, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there for applause. I was there for survival, for stability, for the belief that hard work built a shield around you. But here is the truth no one tells you. Hard work doesn't always shield you. Sometimes it blinds you, it makes you believe you're safe, when in reality you're disposable. I saw it happen to others over the years. Good people, kind people, shown the door because of numbers on a screen or the impatience of a manager who wanted to look tough. I told myself it wouldn't happen to me, because I was careful, because I gave them everything. I ignored the warning signs, the way the world was changing, the way people became digits instead of souls. The colleagues around me were a mix of faces. Some respected me, calling me steady hands. Others smirked, whispering that I was just part of the furniture, too loyal, too blind to leave. I let their words slide off me, convincing myself that loyalty was not weakness. It was strength. I told myself that one day they would see it too. And in the midst of this, there was always the same rhythm. I'd clock in, nod politely to the receptionist, take my seat, and dive into the endless stream of tasks. Papers piled high, phone calls unanswered until my fingers found the receiver, deadlines constantly pressing like a noose around our necks. Lunches were often eaten cold, between filing cabinets and ringing phones. Vacations were few, and even then I found myself checking in, answering questions no one else could handle. I never complained. I believed that silence was the price of keeping peace. I thought that if I kept my head down, if I gave them my best, they would see me as irreplaceable. I was wrong. They didn't see me at all. You know, as I share this with you, I want to pause for a second. If you've ever felt invisible in a place you gave your whole heart to, if you've ever worked tirelessly and felt like no one noticed, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. It helps these stories reach others who need to be reminded that they are not alone. Sometimes hearing that someone else lived your struggle is the first step toward finding courage. Looking back, I realize how many little sacrifices I made. The birthdays I missed, the nights I worked through sickness, the moments I promised myself I'd rest tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Every bit of myself I poured into that company, believing it was an investment in my security, believing that loyalty meant safety. But in truth, it was a gamble, and I had placed every chip on, a table run by people who would never care for me the way I cared for them. There's something cruel in realizing that all those years, all that discipline, all that loyalty, can be undone by a clock hand moving just 2 minutes past. But maybe what hurts more is the realization that deep down, I already knew they didn't value me. I just refused to admit it. Because to admit it meant acknowledging that my sacrifices had been for nothing. Yet here's the strange thing about injustice. It has a way of waking you up. It shakes you from the trance of routine, forces you to look at yourself, forces you to ask, what am I worth outside of this place? That question haunted me in those days, echoing louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights, louder than the ticking clock that would later seal my fate. And maybe that's why I kept silent about the inheritance, because part of me wanted to see who I was without it. I wanted to prove that I could stand on my own. But when they fired me for being 2 minutes late, I realized the inheritance wasn't just money. It was a chance to turn humiliation into something greater, a chance to rewrite the story they thought they controlled. So let me ask you, if everything you gave your life to dismissed you in an instant, what would you do? Would you cling to the ruins, or would you find the courage to build something new? If you're still here with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's a small action, but it makes all the difference in keeping stories like this alive. It was a morning like so many others. The alarm clock buzzed, the same harsh sound it had made for years, and I rose with the same heaviness in my bones. But that day, something small and ordinary conspired against me. The bus I took daily screeched to a halt mid-route, stuck behind an accident. Minutes slipped by as I sat helplessly, my fingers tapping on my knee, my eyes locked on the time displayed above the driver. 2 minutes. That was all the delay when I finally walked through the company's glass doors. 2 minutes. I hurried down the hallway, my breath shallow, already rehearsing apologies for the minor delay. I expected perhaps a raised eyebrow, a dismissive wave, maybe even a small reprimand. What I did not expect was the sight that greeted me when I reached my desk. My manager stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, and papers stacked neatly on the corner like a farewell waiting to be signed. "You're late," he said, his voice slicing through the air with no mercy. "Only 2 minutes," I replied softly, trying to steady my voice. "The bus was—" He cut me off. "Excuses are meaningless here. Rules are rules." My co-workers lifted their heads at the sharp tone. Some glanced back down quickly, unwilling to meet my eyes, while others lingered just long enough to witness the unfolding spectacle. I felt the weight of their silence pressing into me, each second stretching out until those 2 minutes became an entire lifetime of judgment. "Please," I whispered. "You know my record. You know I've never been late before. Not once in all these years." But he didn't soften. He didn't even blink. Instead, he slid the envelope toward me across the desk. "We can't tolerate carelessness. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." My body went cold. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. Terminated. For 2 minutes? For all the birthdays I had missed? All the nights I stayed past midnight? Finishing tasks no one else wanted? For all the years of silence and service? This was what it amounted to? The room was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. I bent down to pick up my bag, my movements slow, deliberate, as though I could buy time before reality struck. But the reality was already there, sharp and unyielding, written in the smirk that flickered across his lips. He wanted me gone, not because of 2 minutes. No, this was about power, about control, about making an example. And I was the unlucky one chosen to bear it. The worst part wasn't even his words. It was the way no one else spoke up. I looked around the office, at faces I had known for decades, people I had helped, encouraged, covered for. None of them met my eyes. Not one voice rose in my defense. In that silence, I realized how alone I truly was. A security guard appeared at my side, as if I were a criminal. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a message. Leave quickly, leave quietly, leave as if you never existed here at all. I gathered my belongings into a box they had conveniently placed by the desk, a box that seemed to mock me. My hands trembled as I placed a family photo inside, the corners of the frame scratching against cardboard. Each item I packed felt like another piece of myself they were discarding. Walking down that hallway with the guard at my side was the longest walk I had ever taken. The sound of my heels against the floor echoed, each step a drumbeat of humiliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout to everyone watching that I had given everything, that I deserved better, that 2 minutes should never outweigh 20 years. But I didn't. I stayed silent, because silence, in that moment, was my shield. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I stood there for a moment, clutching the box to my chest, as the doors closed behind me with a finality that made my stomach turn. I was no longer an employee. I was no longer part of their world. I was dismissed, erased, forgotten, at least in their eyes. But in my silence, something stirred. A seed. A whisper. A reminder that this humiliation, this cruel dismissal, was not the end. It was the spark. If you've ever been judged harshly for a mistake so small, if you've ever felt like the years of your loyalty meant nothing to those in power, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe. Because sharing these stories matters. It helps us build a community where invisible sacrifices are finally seen, where silence is transformed into strength. As I stood outside that building, clutching everything I had left, I made a quiet promise to myself. They would regret underestimating me, not with shouts, not with anger, but with something they couldn't control. Something far more powerful than their rules or their clocks. And little did they know, the same woman they fired for being 2 minutes late was already holding the key to their future. The walk home that day felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. My arms clutched the cardboard box filled with the fragments of a life I had built inside those walls, but it wasn't the weight of the items that bent my shoulders. It was the realization that everything I had poured into that place, years, health, loyalty, sacrifice, had been tossed aside in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee. 2 minutes. That was all it took to erase decades of devotion. I kept asking myself if I should have fought harder. In that office, if I should have begged or shouted, if I should have reminded them of the endless days I stayed late, of the mornings I came early, of the loyalty they had never truly deserved. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Nothing I could have said would have mattered. They had already decided I was disposable. My voice, no matter how strong, would not have changed the verdict. That silence I carried out of the building was not weakness. It was clarity. When I reached my small apartment, I set the box down on the kitchen table and stared at its contents. A photo of my children when they were young, still smiling with innocence. A mug chipped on the rim, one I used to drink endless cups of bitter coffee during long nights of overtime. A stack of pens, some still with the company logo. Objects that once seemed ordinary now felt like relics from a life that had ended in an instant. I sat there for hours, barely moving, my mind drifting through the years. The birthdays I missed because deadlines loomed. The dinners I skipped because I was too tired to cook after long shifts. The mornings I left my home in darkness, promising myself that all the sacrifice would mean something. Every memory, every compromise I had made for that company, replayed in my head like a cruel film reel, each scene punctuated by the reality that none of it mattered when the clock ticked 2 minutes past. There is a special kind of pain in realizing that your value in someone else's eyes can be measured by a hand on a clock. Not by your character, not by your devotion, not by your humanity, but by a rule applied without compassion. That was the betrayal I carried with me, heavier than the humiliation. It wasn't just that they had fired me. It was that they had looked at me, at all that I had given, and decided I was worth less than punctuality. But as I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, something deeper began to stir beneath the pain. A memory resurfaced of my father, sitting at the same table decades ago, his hands calloused from years of labor. He used to tell me, never let anyone decide your worth. Your time, your loyalty, your love, it's priceless. Don't give it away to those who can't see it. At the time, I thought he was just speaking about life in general. But now, those words burned in me with new truth. He had left me something before he died, something I had kept hidden. An inheritance, built from his sacrifices, his wisdom, his relentless belief that family mattered more than anything else. I had never touched it. I told myself I wanted to build my own life, to prove that I could stand without leaning on what he had left. But now, As the silence of betrayal pressed against me, I saw the inheritance differently. It wasn't money, it was possibility. It was freedom. It was a chance to write a different ending to the story they thought they had finished. For the first time since stepping out of that office, I lifted my head. The humiliation still clung to me, the betrayal still burned, but beneath it all, there was a flicker of something new. Not revenge, not yet, but resolve. I realized that day that betrayal doesn't just break you, it strips away illusions. It forces you to face truths you've buried, to see yourself not through the eyes of those who dismiss you, but through your own. And as much as it hurt, as much as it hollowed me out, I understood something vital. They had freed me without meaning to. By discarding me, they had given me the gift of clarity. The question now wasn't whether I had been wronged. That much was clear. The question was what I would do with the truth I now carried. Would I let their judgment define me forever? Or would I rise from the ashes of their dismissal and build something so strong they would never be able to erase me again? I closed my eyes that night with that question burning in my mind, knowing the answer would not come quickly, but believing it was already waiting for me. Because sometimes the deepest betrayals plant the seeds of the greatest transformations. And so, I ask you, if everything you built was torn away in a single moment of cruelty, would you sink into the silence of humiliation? Or would you let that silence become the ground where your new life begins? The morning after that night of restless reflection, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The pain was still there, heavy as stone, but it no longer chained me. It pushed me. Betrayal has a way of burning away hesitation, of leaving only the raw steel of resolve. As I sipped the first bitter coffee of the day, I looked at the small folder where I had kept the documents of my father's inheritance, untouched all this time. My hands trembled as I opened it, but not with fear, with purpose. Inside were pages I had glanced at before but never dared to use. Account statements, investment certificates, letters written in my father's firm, careful hand. In one of them he had written, "This is not for you to survive on. This is for you to rise with." I had thought the words poetic at the time, perhaps even dramatic. But now they rang like prophecy. He had left me not just money, but a chance to take back what the world thought it had stripped away from me. I spent days quietly gathering information. I contacted an attorney I had once met through a friend, someone who specialized in acquisitions and corporate restructuring. Sitting in that office, telling my story, felt surreal. The woman listened patiently, her eyes narrowing when I described the way I was dismissed. When I mentioned the inheritance, her posture changed. She leaned forward and said, "You have more options than you realize. The question is, what do you want?" That question echoed in me. For years, what I had wanted never mattered. My job, my routine, my life, it had all been shaped by what others demanded of me. But now, for the first time, I had the means to choose. Did I want revenge? Did I want to destroy the people who had humiliated me? Or did I want something larger, something that would prove that 2 minutes could not erase me? That nothing could? We began exploring possibilities. At first, the numbers and strategies overwhelmed me. But as I studied the reports, the valuations, the weaknesses in the company's structure, I realized something shocking. They weren't as strong as they pretended to be. Behind the shiny glass doors and the talk of discipline, there were cracks. Cracks wide enough for me to step through if I was bold enough. And boldness was all I had left. With my attorney's guidance, I began the process of acquiring shares. Quietly, carefully, through channels that wouldn't raise alarms. Every meeting felt like stepping into a different version of myself. No longer the woman begging for her worth at the edge of a desk, but someone who carried the power to rewrite the story. I dressed differently, spoke differently, even carried myself differently. Not out of pretense, but because I could feel the change happening inside me. There was one moment that still lingers in my memory. Sitting in a sleek office, pen in hand, papers spread before me, I hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed hard. Signing meant stepping fully into a role I never imagined for myself. My father's words came back to me, steady and sure. "Rise." So I signed. With each stroke of the pen, I felt chains fall away. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving them wrong. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming myself, about turning silence into strength, humiliation into strategy, betrayal into fuel. Weeks passed, and the puzzle pieces fell into place. What they never knew, what they could not possibly imagine, was that the woman they had mocked for being 2 minutes late was now positioned to become their superior. The irony was almost poetic. Their arrogance had blinded them. They had believed they were untouchable, that rules gave them power, but soon they would see what true power looked like. And as the final documents were delivered to me, as the seal of ownership was placed firmly in my hands, I knew the day was coming. The day I would walk back into that building, not as their discarded employee, but as their new reality. Because sometimes the smallest spark of injustice lights the fire that changes everything. Tell me, if life handed you the chance to return to the very place that betrayed you, not as a victim, but as the one holding the reins, would you take it? Or would you turn your back and let them rot in their own arrogance? The day I returned to that building was colder than most. The air cut sharp against my face, the same way it had the morning I was escorted out with a box in my arms, but this time my hands were empty. I carried no cardboard, no relics of humiliation. Instead, I carried something far greater: ownership, power. The undeniable truth that the story they thought they had written for me was no longer theirs to tell. As I walked through the glass doors, I felt the stares. Some recognized me instantly. The receptionist's jaw slackened, her eyes widening as though she had seen a ghost. Others whispered, their voices too low for me to catch, but I knew what they were saying. Wasn't she fired? What is she doing here? I didn't flinch. I didn't rush. Every step was deliberate, the sound of my heels echoing across the marble floor, announcing that the woman they thought was gone had returned. Not broken, but unshakable. The office smelled the same: burnt coffee, recycled air, paper ink. But everything felt different now. Not because the walls had changed, but because I had. No longer a silent worker trying to prove her worth, I was the one who decided the worth of others. I passed familiar desks, the same people who had averted their eyes the day I was escorted out now, looking up at me with curiosity, even fear. I didn't meet their stares. I kept moving forward, my gaze fixed on the office at the end of the hall. The manager, my manager, the man who had humiliated me, was inside. His door was half open, as though he were waiting for someone, though certainly not for me. I stepped in without knocking. He looked up from his desk, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice carrying that same sharpness I remembered. The same arrogance, but as I walked forward and placed the documents neatly on his desk, the color drained from his face. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, and when they met mine again, there was no irritation left. Only disbelief. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied, my voice calm, steady, and louder than any shout I could have mustered. "You fired me for being 2 minutes late, and now I own the very company that let you make that choice." He leaned back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For once, he had no words, no rehearsed phrases about policy or discipline. He was stripped bare, exposed not by anger but by truth. The silence in that office was thick. Employees had begun to gather outside the door, their heads peeking in, their curiosity uncontainable. I let them see. I wanted them to witness this moment. Not because I craved applause, but because they needed to know that injustice does not always stand unchallenged. I gave this place decades of my life, I continued, my voice strong but not trembling with rage. And you erased it with the stroke of a clock hand. You thought 2 minutes to find me. But now I define what happens here. I could see him shrinking behind the desk, his authority crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. For years he had thrived on power, on control, on the ability to silence others with nothing more than a glare. But now, with one signature, I had undone all of it. The whispers outside grew louder. People exchanged glances, some shocked, others smiling faintly as though justice had finally found its way into those walls. I caught the eye of one woman I had once mentored, her lips curving into the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement that she saw me not as a victim, but as someone who had risen. The manager tried one last time, his voice brittle. You can't just come in here and... Oh, but I can, I said softly, cutting him off the way he had once cut me. Because now, the rules you hid behind are mine to rewrite. He said nothing after that. He couldn't. I gathered the papers from his desk, tucking them back into the folder. Then I turned, stepping past the crowd of employees who had gathered in the doorway. Their faces followed me, some wide with awe, others with quiet hope. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. Walking back down that hallway, the same hallway I had once trudged in humiliation, felt different now. Each step was not just movement, it was reclamation. The walls that once suffocated me now echoed with the sound of justice. And yet, even in victory, a question lingered in my mind. Now that I held the power, what would I do with it? Would I wield it as a weapon of revenge, cutting down those who had betrayed me? Or would I rebuild, reshape, and turn this place into something better than it had ever been? The choice was mine, and in that choice lay the true measure of freedom. When I walked out of that office for the second time, it was nothing like the first. The first time, I carried a box that felt heavier than my heart could bear, each step echoing humiliation. The second time, my hands were empty, yet I felt I carried the weight of destiny itself. The same walls that once consumed my energy now bowed, silent witnesses to the truth that power can change hands in an instant. But victory is never as simple as standing taller than those who once looked down on you. It lingers, it questions, it whispers late at night when the adrenaline fades. As I left that building, I found myself asking, what now? What should I do with this power I had fought for? Not through anger, but through patience, silence, and resolve. For the first time in decades, I had choices. I could reshape the company into something that honored people, something that rewarded loyalty instead of punishing it. Or I could wield my new authority as a blade, cutting down those who had once mocked me, repaying humiliation with humiliation. Both options pulsed through me like twin currents, and the decision was mine alone to make. Freedom is heavier than chains. People think being free means lightness, joy, release. But true freedom is weighty, because it places responsibility on your shoulders. No one else to blame, no one else to answer to. You are the author now. I had been erased once, dismissed as a shadow, and now I had the pen back in my hand. What I would write next could define not just my life, but the lives of everyone who walked through those glass doors. As I stood outside, watching employees peer through the windows at me, I felt the sting of memories. All the years I gave, all the sacrifices I made, all the nights I thought loyalty would protect me, it all returned in flashes. But alongside the bitterness, there was something else. Gratitude. Because if they hadn't humiliated me, if they hadn't stripped me bare, I never would have discovered the strength buried inside me. Sometimes the cruelty of others is the very chisel that frees us from stone. I thought of my father's words, written so carefully in his letters. This is not for you to survive on. This is for you to rise with. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me a map, a key, a charge to step into a life where I would no longer let others define my worth. For the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. I don't know yet what I will choose. I don't know whether I will cleanse the company of the arrogance that rotted its heart, or burn the system down to its foundations and rebuild from the ashes. What I do know is this: the woman they thought they discarded has become the woman who will decide their future. And there is a power in that realization no one can ever take away. If you've stayed with me through this story, you already know its heartbeat. This isn't just about a job or a company, it's about dignity. It's about how quickly the world can strip you bare, and how much faster you can rise when you remember who you are. And if you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, humiliated for being less than perfect, then maybe you know too that one small injustice can be the seed of your greatest transformation. I hope this story stirred something inside you, reminded you that your silence is not emptiness, that your worth cannot be measured in minutes. And if it did, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel, not for me, but because it helps stories like this find the people who most need to hear them. Someone out there right now is standing outside their own version of those glass doors, wondering if they matter. Maybe your click will bring them here. Maybe it will give them courage. So I leave you with this question. If life handed you the power to return to the very place that betrayed you, would you choose revenge or would you choose transformation? Think about it carefully, because the answer says more about who you are than any rulebook ever could. And stay close, because in the next story, you'll see how betrayal takes a different form, one hidden behind the mask of family. And the truth waiting there will leave you questioning what loyalty really means. Life has a way of turning moments we think are endings into unexpected beginnings. That day, when I was told I was worthless because of 2 minutes, I thought I had reached the lowest point of my life. Everything I believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and discipline crumbled around me. Yet now, standing on the other side of humiliation, I see it differently. That day wasn't the end. It was the door. The truth is, humiliation often carries a gift wrapped inside its sting. At first, all you feel is the fire of shame, the weight of betrayal, the echo of cruel voices telling you that you don't matter. But if you listen closely, beneath the pain is a whisper calling you to rise, to see yourself not as others define you, but as you are, capable, worthy, resilient. That whisper is easy to ignore when life seems comfortable, but when everything is stripped away, it becomes impossible to silence. I carried that whisper with me through the long nights of doubt, through the endless memories of sacrifice that had been dismissed with a smirk. And with time, that whisper grew into a roar. It reminded me of the inheritance my father left me, not just the money, but the faith he had in me, the belief that his daughter would one day carry his strength forward. What they tried to erase in me, he had already planted. And that seed waited, patient, until the moment it was needed most. Faith is often misunderstood. People think faith is about knowing what will happen, about certainty, about guarantees. But to me, faith became something different. It was the courage to keep walking even when the path was hidden. It was trusting that my worth was not measured by policies or time clocks, but by the way I could transform pain into power. Faith was choosing to believe that 2 minutes of dismissal could never outweigh decades of devotion, and that the betrayal I faced could become the very fuel I needed to rise. When I think of that office now, I don't just see walls of arrogance and cruelty. I see a stage where the greatest reversal of my life played out. They thought they had ended my story, but the story was only beginning. And isn't that the truth for so many of us? The places we are broken often become the very places we discover what we are made of. If you are listening now, maybe you carry your own box of humiliation, your own memory of being dismissed, discarded, overlooked. Maybe you've been told you were too small, too late, too unimportant to matter. Let me tell you this. Your worth is not determined by their rules. It is not measured by their clocks. It is not erased by their indifference. Your worth is written in the resilience that refuses to break, in the faith that refuses to die, in the quiet strength that waits for its moment to rise. The greatest transformations often come in silence, not with noise, not with applause, but in the quiet decision to stand back up when the world expects you to stay down. And once you rise, once you reclaim your voice, there is no humiliation strong enough to chain you again. I don't know yet whether I will rebuild that company into something better or strip it bare and start anew. That decision is still unfolding, but what I do know is that I will never again let someone else decide my worth. And I hope, if you carry anything from my story, it is that truth. No one has the right to define you, only you do. If this story has touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your own strength in moments of darkness, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because together we can build a space where no one feels invisible again. And your support makes these stories reach the ones who need them most. And now I leave you with this. What happens when betrayal doesn't come from a workplace, but from the people closest to your heart? In the next story, you'll see how loyalty twisted by family cuts deeper than any employer's cruelty. Stay with me, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust, love, and the price of silence.